MBA 500 leadership here. This is about the basic approaches to leadership, except truthfully, there is no really basic approach because leadership is very complex. There are so many different styles of leaders, so many different traits, and even theories of leadership. And we know there are all kinds of leaders. There's not a one-size-fits-all package. We can go from today's environment, like Elon Musk, all the way to yesterday, Harriet Tubman. We can talk about Gandhi. We can talk about, oh, I don't know, some of the people that ran General Motors, like Alfred Sloan. There are so many types of leaders in business. John D. Rockefeller, that was from yesteryear. What about Jeff Bezos from Amazon? What about political leaders? So join us and we'll talk about the idea of what is a basic concept. So what is leadership? It is the ability to influence a group or individuals toward the achievement of a goal. So leaders are different than managers because leaders have something in them. It could be charisma, like we talked about in the last YouTube, charisma meaning the Greek word meaning gift that makes people want to follow the individual that is leading. Or it could be you're leading a group towards a goal, towards a vision, towards a mission. And a leader can also be a manager, but a manager doesn't always necessarily become a leader. So the two are not necessarily interchangeable. A leader can be a manager, but a manager doesn't always have to be a leader. And here we have a picture of our Apple founder, Steve Jobs. And he also founded Apple with Stephen Wozniak, and the two of them, they had quite different personalities. And but yet the picture here, Stephen Jobs, he rose to one of the leadership authority. Management, though, is the use of authority. It's a use of ranks, hierarchies, that is designated to obtain compliance from organizational members. Now, you might have incentives. You might use the old carrot and stick approach in management, but leadership is something different. It's something that we all should be aspiring to. Now, there are different versions. Now, we already talked about this in a previous YouTube, but the trait theories that consider personality, social, physical, or intellectual traits to differentiate leaders from non-leaders. And that makes sense to most people. If you're a wallflower and you're stuck, shy and you're introverted and you don't speak out, probably you're not going to be perceived as a leader. But if you look at some of these other traits, extroversion, conscientiousness, openness, emotional intelligence or EQ. And that when we think about emotional intelligence, we're thinking about, wait a minute, does that leader understand how his or her emotions impact other people? Because emotions are contagious. And are they able to regulate their own emotion, as well as are they sensitive to the emotions of others? So there's a lot of packed into this emotional intelligence component. So trait theories, basically, there's no universal traits that we found that can predict leadership in all situations. What might be effective, say, for example, in a military strategy or in an emergency situation, in a very autocratic, authoritarian model. So if there was a fire that all of a sudden started raging in our classroom, we would want someone that has a clear direction of where we're going and has no difficulty telling others what we need to be doing. So, but there aren't any particular universal traits because it depends on the situation. There's also unclear evidence of the cause and effect of the relationship between leadership and traits. And the better predictor of the appearance of leadership than distinguishing effective and ineffective leaders are oftentimes behaviors. So here's the trait approach. We have extroversion, conscientiousness, and that is to, like, if you're supposed to do something, are you going to do it? Like, wait a minute, I said I was going to get back to someone by the end of today, so I'm going to do that. That's a conscientiousness. And also open to critique, open to learning. So that's really critical in one of those traits. The other assumption is that leaders are born, and the goal is to select leaders. Now, the problem is that traits don't generalize across situations, right? Just like we talked before. So if you're a leader of a preschool group versus a leader of the military versus a leader of a college, yeah, your traits are going to be different. So it's better at predicting leader emergence than leader effectiveness when we think about these traits that our leaders are born with. This is not exactly the same as the great man theory. It's saying that we are all born with certain personalities and certain traits. So the behavioral theories of leadership. There are two interesting studies about this. Well, actually, there's more than two, but we would just focus on two in this course. And these are the theories that specific behaviors differentiate leaders from non-leaders. So the first theory is that leaders' behaviors can be taught. So we can learn how to be more inspiring to people, how to be more cognizant of our own emotions and our be able to regulate our emotions better than maybe we would typically be based upon our personality. And then we have trait theory. These are leaders are born and not made. And it kind of goes back again to that idea that great man or great woman theory that we're born as leaders. Now, as I said, a couple studies were the Ohio State studies and the University of Michigan studies, and these were way back in the late 40s, early 50s. We began to investigate after Frederick W. Taylor started to look at how management and productivity was occurring in the workplace and began to study that, Frederick W. Taylor. But so the Ohio State studies, University of Michigan studies came after that. And what they found about leadership is that there are two really opposite forces that balance a leader. The one is initiating structure. And as this says here, this is the production orientation. And basically, it's saying, can a leader be task oriented? If all of a sudden you were put in charge of a department that produces something, and I don't want to use the word widgets, but produces jewelry or produces laptops or produces a service, doesn't matter what. Are you the kind of leader then go, wait a minute here, let me create systems, let me create processes, let me create ways in which people can get the job done. So it's you're oriented towards productivity. And the other side of that coin, so as one is being task oriented, the other side of the coin is being employee oriented. Like, in other words, we need to get this task done today, but yeah, I know that it's, my main employee, that her husband's in the hospital and she needs to leave at 3 o'clock, but we have to ship this out by 5. So what do? A leader balances those considerations. Now, the assumption here is that leaders can be trained, and the goal is to continue to develop leaders. Now, again, the problem, just sort of similar to traits, behaviors are something that we can measure. They're more consistent. I do this a certain way. I have a habit of every day I check my emails first thing. That's a habit. It's not just necessarily a trait that I have of being a kind of a consistent habitual person, but it's actually something that people can measure. But still, these behaviors don't generalize across situations. So maybe I'm a real good task-oriented production manager type, but that's not going to work in a college setting when you have intellectual people of high IQs and with PhDs, and they maybe want to pontificate and talk and ruminate about a subject. Then, task manager may not be. In the Ohio State studies, as I mentioned, there's initiating structure to the extent to which the leader is likely to define and structure his or her role and those of subordinates in the search for goal attainment. So basically, they're saying we've got to get this process in place. We have to get these tasks completed. We have to get an outcome. And so how are we going to do the process? How are we going to get everyone in line so that they know what to do in order to secure an end result? And then consideration is the extent to which a leader is likely to have a job relationships characterized by mutual trust, respect, understanding of the subordinate's ideas, and regarding his or her feelings. So as I said, these studies are indicating leadership is two sides of a coin: task orientation, productivity orientation, getting the job done, and then Okay, how, treating your employees like real people. Now, the managerial grid by Blake and Moulton, it represents a 9x9 grid. And basically what it does is just take that concept of what we looked at before with the Ohio State studies and the Michigan studies, which are very, very similar, and break it out even into more detail so that you can see how this could be classified. If you look on the vertical axis and you see concern for people, high and low. And then if you look on the horizontal axis, you see concern for productivity or production, that taskmaster part of ourselves, high or low. So when you look to be the most effective leader would be a 9.9. High productivity, concern for productivity, high concern for people. But again, that's not always necessarily the best, because if you're in an environment that's more low-key, as I said, like a college, talking around with a bunch of professors, they're not necessarily going to be right up here at 9.9. Rather, they will be high on concern for people, but less likely to be so concerned about productivity if they're talking about theories and so forth. So just to give you an idea how it works is that the concern for task and production is the one, and the concern for people is on the other. Now, there are several different contingency theories. Now, in this particular slideshow, we're not going to go into quite a bit of detail, but there is the Fiedler's contingency model, the cognitive resource theory, Hersey's and Blanchard's situational leadership starts to give you a clue. Wait a minute, leadership isn't always the same. It depends on the situation, and path goal theory. Now, there are assumptions underlying the different models. In the Fiedler model, the leadership style is pretty well fixed, but in others, the leadership style can and should be changed. So to give you an example, in the Fiedler style, leadership style is fixed. It's like having a parent, I'll say like a father that's a disciplinarian. And the father is the disciplinarian for every single child he has. From the oldest son to the youngest daughter, it's all the same. It's the same approach, the same disciplinarian. However, on these other models, it's like, wait a minute here. The leader may still be at his heart, his traits, a disciplinarian, and may even exemplify some of those behaviors, but realizes that each child is different. And some he has to handle with kid gloves, other he can be more himself and direct. So this is what we mean by that. It's that your style can change and should change depending on the situation. So the leader, when the style is fixed, it's either your task-oriented versus your relationship-oriented. And it also considers the situational favorableness of the leader. So it looks at what are the leader-member relations? What is the task structure? And what is the position power? So in other words, it's saying how is the leader interacting with those people in the organization? So is it like someone at the top and you are a direct report, or are you far down the chain of command? So, and then or is it something where there's a special project in the organization? So even though you're farther down on the chain of command, you may be a cafeteria worker, but somehow you got involved in the holiday party planning or something, and that was headed up by the vice president. So there is some tasks that goes along the organization. And then lastly, it's position power. So does your position have authority? Are you accountable for a budget, or is it one that is merely one that is tries to influence others at the same level? So the key assumption is that leaders must fit the situation. The options to accomplish this are select a leader to fit the situation, or, according to this Fiedler's model, change the situation to fit the leader. So, both of those, I think, have some room for thought. If we know that we're going to be in a project management environment and things are changing really rapidly with technology, it's very turbulent, we might need to update our job description, and not only that, the characteristics of what we're looking for in a leader in order to run that situation. On the other hand, if we have a leader that is like that father that was the disciplinarian with the 3 kids, and let's say he's an authoritarian, very task-oriented kind of guy, and he's in the organization, we don't want to get rid of him. He's an asset. But he wouldn't necessarily be an asset when you have to develop all these relationships and the situations are changing constantly. That might not be his strong suit. So what we need to do is change the situation so it complies more with what we have, because we only have one leader in that whole small department, let's say. So lots to think about in this slide. So again, in Fiedler, the leadership style is fixed, and it can be measured by the least preferred coworker questionnaire. It sounds a little odd, but that's what they call it. And it's the way in which a leader will evaluate a coworker who is not liked, will indicate whether the leader is task or relationship oriented. So the bottom line is this. Remember the example I gave you about that disciplinarian, often authoritarian kind of father, doesn't change his style much with his children, comes to work, he's in charge of a department, doesn't change his style much. And so what does the least preferred coworker have to do with it? Well, let's say he's a department of 10 people, and he's going to evaluate that coworker based upon his own traits. So if he's a task-oriented kind of person and wants to get all the packages out, or works at UPS, maybe he's a department manager at UPS, wants to get those packages out all by a certain time. So you've got a coworker over here who really needs a lot of hand-holding and wants a relationship and all that. Well, that's going to be the least preferred coworker. And that will tell you a lot about our authoritarian, disciplinarian department head. Now, cognitive resource theory is a theory of leadership that states that the level of stress in a situation is what impacts whether leaders' intelligence or experience will be more effective. And I want to just add something to this cognitive resource theory. It's talking about stress in a situation. And so if you're stressed, are you using your experience, falling back on that, or are you using your smarts, your intellect, your IQ to figure out what is a possible resolution? Well, I do want to just divert for 1 second. It's not on this slide, but to tell you about the concept of HALT, H-A-L-T, HALT. And H-A-L-T represents do not make decisions, if at all possible, while you are either hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. HALT. Don't do it. So it's similar kind of thing. Like we're under stress when we're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. All right. So research support. This is saying that less intelligent individuals perform better in leadership roles under high stress than do those that are more intelligent. That's interesting, but it's true. It's like, okay, because maybe those less intelligent people, they perform better because they're not getting down into all of the nuances and mapping out all the possible scenarios like decision making or scenario mapping. It's kind of like way back when in the late 1970s, we had a president of the United States, Jimmy Carter. He was a Democratic president, and some claimed that his IQ was off the roof. I mean, he was pretty much certified as a genius. However, he had a problem. The problem was he was too smart because he could see so many details that was very difficult to make decisions in times of stress. Less experienced people perform better in leadership positions under low stress than do more experienced people, and that's pretty basic kind of edict there. How about the contingency model from Hersey and Blanchard? And this is a situational model. And it says that considers leaders' behavior, task, and relationship, and assumes that leaders can change their behaviors. Can a zebra change its stripes? Not always. But there are some people that are actually open systems. So they have feedback from others. They generate and they reflect on that feedback, and then they set out to change themselves. This is why it's not popular today, but why in the past that 360 evaluation was important, was because, individual will be getting feedback from all sides, from their direct reports, from their boss, from their boss's boss, and also from their peers at the same level. But as I mentioned, that's not as in vogue anymore. But that's what this is about. It's assuming, if we're using 360 evaluation, we're assuming that because of that, leaders, once they get the feedback that they're a little bit off, that they'll change their behaviors. But that's not always the case. Now, it also considers followers as the situation. So a follower has task maturity, so ability and experience, and also a follower might have psychological maturity, willingness to take responsibilities. So it's not just looking at the task and relationships. It's saying we assume they're going to change. The leaders are going to change their habits and the way they do things and their behaviors. And it also analyzes more, who are these followers? And are they mature, are psychologically, or do they have experience? And then assumptions are the leaders can and should change their style to fit their followers' degree of readiness. That's their willingness and their ability. So it's possible to train leaders to have the kind of style that their followers want. That's according to this model. Personally, I think that's a no. This is a non-starter. This is very difficult to do, and you start becoming a chameleon. You're not yourself. So I am not a big advocate of this model. Now we also have the situational leadership theory, and there's some good points in this theory. It's a contingency theory that focuses on followers' readiness, and the more ready the followers, the more willing and able, the less need for leader support and supervision. And you can see we go on the continuum from high to low, and the amount of follower readiness from high to low for the leader, and the amount of leader support and supervision. So it really is sort of a dance between how much knowledge, skills, and experience the leader has, and how much do the followers have. So for example, when I was 25 years old, I ended up with a position as a supervisor of a department in a bank, and had microfilm, microfiche. It was an operations position, which I didn't know anything about. I didn't know anything about the banking industry. I didn't know hardly anything about microfilm, microfiche, all this equipment, nothing. But the individuals, my followers, they were older. They were in their 60s, late 50s, 60s, and they had been doing this for years. And I came in as a 25-year-old not knowing anything. So, okay, so wait, were they ready to follow me or not? So I had to be very careful about how I approached that, how I listened to them and their knowledge and respected it, but at the same time made it clear that I was the leader and we would be changing things. But I had to know exactly what we were doing in order to change those things. So here is some different styles, leadership styles, and follower readiness. And if, again, we see follower readiness, and what are we saying here? We're saying they're able and unable, or unwilling or willing. And so these are the different styles. Well, if someone is able to follow you, so just like the 6-year-olds that I talked about, but they were unwilling because they thought, what does a 25-year-old know about banking operations that has never worked a day in her life in the bank or in operations? Then the style I needed to have was supportive and participative. Yes, okay, so I had to engage, being support, being respectful, doing all those things, but not so much to the point where it looked like, they could just run the department without me. Also, if they're unwilling and unable, so like say, they didn't know what they're doing either. Let's say I had new employees that were in their 60s and they just got hired the same day I did. Well, I'd have to be directive. I'd have to figure out what I was doing and also be directive. If they're willing and able, then, let them at it. Give them as much freedom as you can. Assess it. Use a litmus test. Always use a litmus test. You give somebody a little bit of something and see how they do. If they tell you they're going to finish it today by 4 o'clock, then they need to finish it today by 4 o'clock. Now, if something comes up and they get hit by a bus or something along those lines, then you expect a communication. I'm being very way out there, but you expect to have some sort of communication about it, or someone getting back to you. And then lastly is they're willing and they're unable. So what does that mean? Their heart's in the right place, but they just don't know how to do the job. They don't know how to run the equipment or the operations. So this would be high task and relationship orientation. So they willing to learn, they just don't know how to do it. So I then would say, let's say if those 60-year-olds were in another department in the bank and then they transferred in, then I would have to say, okay, they're gung-ho, they want to work with me, but they just don't know how to do it, nor do I. So I'd have to learn how to figure out all that equipment and then train them. That would be the job of the leader. So leader-member exchange theory, or LMX for short, and these are that leaders can select certain followers to be in, those are their favorites, based on their competence or compatibility or similarity to the leader. So it's just like, remember before in the previous few slides, I talked about that authoritarian disciplinarian dad who was the same with his 3 kids. And then he went to work and he ran a department, and maybe it was a UPS department, something with high productivity. And he raked his least preferred coworkers as somebody that, was more chatty and had more emotional needs and was more relationship kind of thing. Well, this one's talking about, but the leader could select certain followers to be on the in crowd based upon their competence and or compatibility and similarity to the leader. So if our father that I was talking about said, okay, I'm gonna, I have like 10 followers and 3 of them are really top notch. So I want to treat them a little differently, even though I normally fixed and I never change according to our scenario with that father. Well, this would say I would change, or, I would get you to be compatible, or you'd be in the in crowd. Exchange with these in followers will be higher quality than those that are the out followers. Result is that insubordinates will have a higher performance rating, less turnover, and greater job satisfaction. Well, that's definitely true. But again, this is not a theory I totally endorse. Yes, you have to have people around you that are competent, that understand and are in alignment with what you're trying to do, in this case, task orientation. On the other hand, people, they find out about this, and it's just like having many kids in a family and somebody's the favorite. Everybody else feels ripped off. There's an equity theory. It starts to bring down morale. So this theory, I don't really give a lot of weight to. What I think you should do is I think you should be aware of everyone's strengths, everyone's gifts, everyone's talents, and cultivate that in a way that everyone knows that they're working for the same team and that they're acknowledged. Each gift is acknowledged. Path goal theory. The leader must help the followers attain goals and reduce roadblocks to success. So it's like this. When you are a leader or manager, you have to be engaged in professional development. You have to evaluate your employees. And oftentimes this is a big process. There's a lot of rigmarole to it, where you have to classify if they receive, say, a 5 and that's exemplary, or do they only get a 1, which means they're in danger of losing their job, or does the company itself say, well, everyone should be getting about 3s or 4s? So there's a lot to those evaluations that you have to do in order to see if someone has a raise or if they're getting promoted. Now this says that it's up to the boss, the leader, to say, follower, what are you trying to accomplish this year on your job? And the follower may say, I want to get faster at sending out those packages. If they say that, that's probably right up your line of thinking if you're that authoritarian, task-oriented guy. And so then you say, okay, I'm going to send you to a class on how you could be more efficient. And, if you get a good grade on the class, then you can have a bump up in your pay, something like that. But the leaders must change behaviors to fit the situation. So that's environmental contingencies and subordinate contingencies. So that means that our behaviors are going to have to change in order to fit this situation. Again, it's really causing a lot on the leader that has to really, it's sort of like a servant leader model, but to the point of where you have to be really careful that it doesn't go overboard, and that you're not leading, but what you're doing is you're removing barriers for everyone, and in the end, the job's not getting done. Well, you can see my task orientation is coming out. The leader participation model, the premise here is that rule-based decision tree to guide leaders about when and when not to include subordinates' participation in decision making. Now this is good. Now this considers 12 contingency variables to consider whether or not to include subordinates in decision making. I like this idea. Now, first of all, there are some of us that are autocratic or authoritarian, where we're going to make those decisions and let the chips fall where they may. We're the ones in charge, we're the leaders, and then the subordinates can pick up the pieces, okay? There are some on the other side of the spectrum where they get everyone involved on every decision, and then they'll start to wrestle, you know, their hands about, well, what decision can I make? And no one likes anything. Okay, that's bad too. Also remember, if you ask people for their opinion, let's say your employees, remember that autocratic department head, and he has 10 employees. You get them all around and you say, okay, what do you think we should do? What do you think? What do you think? And everybody says what they think. But then later on you go, well, that's a bad idea. I don't think we're going to do that. And so you say, well, thank you very much, but good, you know, we're going to avoid what you just said, and I'm going to implement what I was thinking anyways. Okay, that is actually worse than if you didn't ask them at all, really, because then now morale sets back down. Why'd you bother asking us? Why are you wasting our time? And then they get frustrated. There's an expectation that they're being engaged, they're being involved. People want their opinion, and then all of a sudden, no, I didn't care after all. So you got to be very careful about how you nuance that. So what I would say is this: is that if you always ask your subordinates to be involved in decision making, you're trapped. If you never ask them to be involved in decision making, you're trapped. But instead, what you should do is you should make decisions and are straightforward with those decisions on occasion, and this is what the decision is. And then on the other hand, you should involve subordinates on a decision. And then if the decision, if their involvement turns out, oh, you got to veer a little bit, then you owe it to them to give them immediate feedback, what they said, what you did with what they said, how you tried to implement it, but this is what happened, and get them involved in problem resolution. So that's intermittent. I always stress intermittent reinforcement. Sometimes do it this way, sometimes that way. Otherwise, if you're too consistent in one way or another, you become trapped, and it's like a noose around you. And all right, so here are